October 9, 1934. A white mobster cornered Stephanie St. Clair in her Sugar Hill office and called her, "just a woman playing gangster." 48 hours later, his body was pulled from the East River. She never touched him. She didn't need to. October 9, 1934. 3:17 p.m. The door to Stephanie St. Clair's office opened without a knock. 4 men walked in. All white. All armed. The kind of men who believed doors opened when they decided, not when they were invited. Stephanie didn't look up from her ledger. The numbers told her everything she needed to know about her empire. 42 runners working Lenox Avenue to 8th Avenue, $18,340 collected that week, 14 new betting parlors opened since January. The scratch of her fountain pen continued, steady and deliberate, as the men arranged themselves in front of her mahogany desk. Outside, October rain hammered Sugar Hill. 409 Edgecombe Avenue sat in the most expensive section of Harlem, where successful black doctors, lawyers and businesspeople, legitimate and otherwise, lived in buildings with doormen and marble lobbies. Stephanie's apartment office occupied the 6th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Persian rugs. Mahogany furniture shipped from Martinique. The trappings of power earned over 22 years. She finished writing. Blotted the ink. Then looked up. The man in front was maybe 35. Red hair. Scar across his left cheek. Expensive suit that didn't quite hide the shoulder holster. His eyes moved around the room like he was calculating what he could take, what he could break. "Stephanie St. Clair," he said. Not a question. A statement that pretended to be respect but wasn't. "You're in my office." Stephanie's voice carried the slightest trace of her Martinique accent, softened by 2 decades in Harlem but never fully erased. She didn't stand. Didn't offer chairs. Uninvited. The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Jimmy Doyle. Maybe you heard of me." He placed both hands on her desk, leaning forward. Intimidation technique. Invasion of space. "I'm here representing certain business interests. Irish interests. We're expanding operations into Harlem, and we're gonna need you to step aside." Stephanie's expression didn't change. She'd heard variations of this speech 17 times in 12 years. Different accents. Same arrogance. "Step aside from what, exactly?" she asked. "Your numbers operation. Lenox Avenue primarily. Maybe 7th Avenue too, depending." Doyle straightened, gestured vaguely. "Look, we know you've had a nice run. Impressive really for a..." He paused, smiled again. "For someone like you. But the territory's changing hands. We're giving you 48 hours to shut down operations, transfer your runners and walk away clean." One of the men behind Doyle shifted his weight. His hand rested on his belt, near where Stephanie could see the outline of a revolver. "Message received. Message irrelevant." "And if I don't?" Stephanie asked. "Come." Curious. Like she was asking about the weather. Doyle's smile disappeared. "Then we shut you down ourselves. And lady, you don't want that. I've shut down tougher operators than you." He leaned forward again, voice dropping. "You're just a woman playing gangster in a man's game. You've done well, I'll give you that. But this." He gestured around the office. "This ends when real players show up. 48 hours. That's generous." Silence filled the room. Rain against windows. Distant car horns from the street below. The slow tick of the clock on Stephanie's wall. 3:21 p.m. Stephanie reached for her cigarette case. Gold-plated. Monogrammed. She took her time selecting one, lighting it with a matching lighter. Exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "I'll consider your offer," she said finally. Doyle grinned. Victory assumed. "Smart woman. We'll be back Friday afternoon for your answer. Make the right choice." The 4 men turned and left. The door closed behind them. Stephanie sat perfectly still for 30 seconds. Listening. Waiting until she heard the elevator descend, heard the lobby door open and close 6 floors below. Then she picked up the telephone. 1 call. 3 minutes. 12 sentences. When she hung up, she stubbed out her cigarette in the crystal ashtray on her desk, a gift from a city councilman whose career she'd saved in 1931, and returned to her ledger. The numbers didn't lie. Neither did men like Jimmy Doyle. He'd given her 48 hours. He thought he was offering her a deadline. He'd actually given her a timeline. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, Stephanie St. Clair made a small notation in the margin of her ledger. October 11th. Call complete. The clock on her wall read 3:24 p.m. 47 hours and 36 minutes remained. To understand why Jimmy Doyle's threat was already a death sentence the moment he made it, you had to understand who Stephanie St. Clair was by October 1934. Not the woman sitting behind the mahogany desk in the fur-trimmed coat and pearl necklace. The woman who had built the empire that desk represented. Martinique. A French colonial island where black children learned early that power belonged to white faces, and survival meant being smarter, faster, and more strategic than anyone expected you to be. Stephanie learned. She watched French administrators walk past her mother's laundry business like the air itself owed them deference. She watched local merchants bow and scrape for customers who treated them like servants. She watched the whole architecture of colonialism, the way it made people believe their station was permanent, unchangeable, divinely ordered. And she decided she would never bow. 26 years old. Stephanie stepped off a steamship at Ellis Island with $10 in her pocket, a sixth-grade education, and something more valuable than either. An understanding that power wasn't given, it was taken carefully, strategically, with patience and precision. She headed to Harlem. Black Harlem in 1912 was a revelation. Families who'd escaped the South. Caribbean immigrants like herself. People building businesses, churches, communities. The beginning of what would become the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz clubs and poetry readings, and the sense that something unprecedented was happening, that black excellence was constructing itself in real time despite every obstacle America could construct. Stephanie found work. Cleaned houses in white neighborhoods during the day. Observed everything at night. She noticed the numbers racket. An illegal lottery system where people bet pennies on three-digit numbers, hoping to win payouts that could change their lives. Simple. Profitable. And in 1912 Harlem, run almost entirely by white operators who extracted wealth from black neighborhoods without reinvesting a single dollar. Stephanie saw the inefficiency, the disrespect, the missed opportunity. By 1920 she was running her own operation. Start small. 1 block. 5 runners. Pay them better than the white operators. Pay out winnings honestly, every time, no exceptions even when it hurt. Build trust. Build reputation. Word spread. By 1923, Stephanie controlled 30 blocks. By 1926, she had 42 runners working for her across Lenox Avenue, 7th Avenue, and 8th Avenue. By 1930, she was clearing $250,000 a year, nearly $4 million in future money, from an operation that employed black Harlem residents, paid fair wages, and put money back into the community. She wasn't just running numbers. She was building infrastructure. Every Sunday, Stephanie sat in the third row at Abyssinian Baptist Church. She wore her finest clothes, tailored dresses from downtown shops that usually didn't serve black customers, fur coats, jewelry that announced success. And when collection plates passed, she donated more than anyone. Not for show. For survival. Because Stephanie understood something white gangsters never would. In Harlem, power came from community protection, not community exploitation. When families couldn't make rent, Stephanie's runners delivered envelopes. No fanfare. No debt owed. Just help. When the Depression hit in 1929 and white-owned businesses fired their black workers first, Stephanie created 40 new runner positions. When police from the 32nd Precinct started shaking down Harlem businesses for protection money, Stephanie gathered evidence, photographs, bank records, witness statements, and quietly made sure certain captains understood that harassment of her territory would result in very public scandals. She built networks. Information networks that reached into every level of Harlem society. Domestics who worked in wealthy white homes and overheard conversations, police clerks who leaked arrest reports, city hall secretaries who shared political gossip, newspaper editors who appreciated tips about corruption stories. By 1934, Stephanie St. Clair knew everything happening in Harlem before most people knew it themselves. She also employed Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy started as her enforcer in 1930. Smart, strategic, loyal. When runners got robbed, Bumpy handled it. When rival operators tried to poach her territory, Bumpy delivered messages. But Stephanie never relied solely on muscle. Bumpy was one tool among many. The phone calls, the evidence files, the carefully cultivated relationships with journalists and politicians. Those were her real weapons. She was 5 feet 7 inches. Always well-dressed. Always composed. She kept a .32 caliber revolver in her desk drawer but rarely touched it. The gun was symbolic. Her real power sat in filing cabinets, dirt on corrupt cops, evidence of white mob activities, documentation of city hall bribe schemes. Information was leverage. Leverage was power. Power was survival. But power as a black woman in 1934 America came with double jeopardy. The white gangsters, Dutch Schultz, the Italian mafia families, Irish mobs, saw her gender first. Woman running numbers sounded like a punchline to them. An aberration. Something temporary that real men would eventually correct. They underestimated her constantly. The black male operators in Harlem respected her success but resented her authority. A Caribbean immigrant woman commanding more territory than men who'd been in Harlem since birth? It violated unspoken rules about hierarchy, about proper place. They waited for her to fail. And the law treated her as both criminal and curiosity. Arrested 17 times between 1929 and 1934. Convicted twice. Both convictions overturned on appeal because Stephanie studied law books in her apartment and knew procedure better than most prosecutors. She turned courtrooms into theaters, representing herself, cross-examining police officers about their own corruption, making judges uncomfortable with how precisely she understood their vulnerabilities. She became legend. Queenie. Madame St. Clair. The numbers queen of Harlem. Newspaper articles described her as elegant, mysterious, dangerous. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, portrayed her as folk hero, the immigrant woman who beat the system, who protected her community, who refused to bow. White newspapers painted her as criminal curiosity, lady gangster, headlines that couldn't decide if she was fascinating or threatening. Stephanie didn't care about headlines. She cared about results. By October 9, 1934, she controlled the most profitable numbers operation in Harlem. She'd survived Dutch Schultz's invasion attempts in the early 1930s, not through violence, but through strategic legal warfare and public exposure campaigns that made Schultz's activities too high profile for comfort. She'd outlasted rival operators. She'd turned police harassment into opportunities for corruption exposure. She'd built something that couldn't be taken by force because it wasn't held by force. It was held by loyalty, by community investment, by intelligence networks, by the understanding that Stephanie St. Clair protected Harlem, and Harlem protected Stephanie St. Clair. Which was why Jimmy Doyle's 48-hour ultimatum revealed exactly one thing. He had no idea who he was threatening. He saw a woman, black, immigrant, operating in a criminal underworld that belonged to white men. He didn't see the networks, the files, the phone calls, the 22 years of strategic relationship building that meant Stephanie could make things happen, or make things disappear, with 3 conversations in 48 hours. He'd walked into her office thinking he was delivering a threat. He'd actually walked into a trap that would close around him before he understood it was there. Stephanie finished her cigarette, returned to her ledger, and waited for Friday. The clock ticked forward. The rain continued. And somewhere in Hell's Kitchen, Jimmy Doyle celebrated what he believed was victory, not knowing he'd just activated his own ending. Jimmy Doyle believed in 3 things: reputation, violence, and the natural order of power. Reputation. He'd killed 3 men in territory disputes across Hell's Kitchen and the Lower East Side. Everyone knew it. No one could prove it, but everyone knew it. That was the point of reputation. It did the work before you had to. Violence. Quick, decisive, public enough to send messages but contained enough to avoid excessive police attention. Break a window. Break a hand. Break a life when necessary. Simple mathematics. And the natural order. Men ran criminal enterprises. White men specifically. Irish, Italian, Jewish, those were the acceptable categories. Women existed in auxiliary roles. Girlfriends. Madams in brothels maybe. Certainly not running multi-block numbers operations generating 6 figures annually. The fact that Stephanie St. Clair violated this natural order meant, in Doyle's logic, that her success was temporary. An anomaly. A correction waiting to happen. He intended to be that correction. Jimmy Doyle was born in Hell's Kitchen in 1899. Grew up watching his father work the docks for 12-hour shifts that barely paid rent. Watched his mother die of tuberculosis because they couldn't afford a doctor. Learned early that legitimate work was a trap, that real money came from taking what you wanted and making sure everyone was too afraid to take it back. By 16 he was running numbers for Vincent "Mad Dog" Call. Call was everything Doyle wanted to become. Feared, wealthy, untouchable. The Irish mob's rising star who challenged Dutch Schultz and lived to tell about it, at least for a while. When Call died in 1932, gunned down in a phone booth on West 23rd Street, Doyle inherited a portion of his operations and an enormous chip on his shoulder. He'd been Call's lieutenant. Should have been his successor. Instead, the remaining Irish operations fractured, distributed among men who'd been with Call longer, who had better connections. Doyle got scraps. It ate at him. For 2 years he rebuilt. Took over a protection racket in Hell's Kitchen. Expanded into the garment district. Made himself useful to bigger players, the Italians mostly, by doing enforcement work they didn't want traced back to their families. But he needed territory. Real territory. The kind that generated consistent revenue, that established him as a serious operator, not just hired muscle. He looked north. To Harlem. Doyle had heard about Stephanie St. Clair. Everyone in New York's criminal underground had heard about her. The black woman running Harlem's numbers. It sounded like a novelty, like one of those, can you believe it, stories you heard in bars. But when Doyle actually researched the operation, asked around, paid for information, the numbers shocked him. $250,000 annually. 40-plus runners. Territory spanning multiple avenues. Relationships with police, politicians, newspaper editors. Impressive for anyone. Unthinkable for a woman. Which meant in Doyle's assessment she'd gotten lucky. Maybe she'd inherited the operation from a man boyfriend or husband who'd died or gotten arrested. Maybe she was fronting for male operators who preferred staying hidden. Maybe Harlem's black community tolerated her because they had limited options. Whatever the explanation, it couldn't be that she'd built and maintained this empire through actual strategic genius. That didn't fit Doyle's understanding of how the world worked. So when he started planning his Harlem expansion in September 1934, he didn't approach Stephanie as a serious adversary requiring careful strategy. He approached her as an obstacle to remove. The campaign started 2 weeks before the October 9th office visit. Doyle sent men to intimidate her runners on Lenox Avenue. Found 2 of them collecting bets outside Small's Paradise on 135th Street. Roughed them up. Nothing serious, black eye, bruised ribs, clear message, find new employment. 3 days later, his crew vandalized 2 of Stephanie's betting parlors. Broke windows. Scattered number slips across 7th Avenue like confetti. Left notes, closing soon. New management coming. The following week, Doyle's men caught one of Stephanie's collectors, young guy named Marcus who'd worked for her 3 years, walking home after his route. They beat him badly enough that he spent 4 days in Harlem Hospital. Doyle watched for Stephanie's response. Nothing. No retaliation. No violence. No contact. To Doyle this confirmed his theory, she was scared. Out of her depth. Probably trying to figure out how to negotiate surrender without losing too much face. Other operators in Harlem watched too. Male operators, black men who'd competed with Stephanie for years, who'd lost territory to her systematic expansion, who'd resented taking orders or direction from a woman. They wondered if Doyle would succeed where they'd failed. If the natural order would finally reassert itself. Some of them quietly hoped he would. Doyle owed money. Substantial money. $8,400 to Italian bookmakers connected to the Genovese family. Gambling debts accumulated over 18 months of bad luck and worse decisions at cards, horses, boxing matches. The Italians were patient but not infinitely patient. They'd given Doyle extensions because he was useful, because he did enforcement work, because killing him would be more trouble than waiting for payment. But they were watching. And Doyle knew it. The Harlem expansion was financial as much as territorial. He needed the revenue. Needed to prove himself. Needed to show that he was a serious operator worthy of respect, not just muscle for hire. He needed Stephanie St. Clair to fold. October 9th. After the office visit, Doyle met his crew at a bar in Hell's Kitchen, McSorley's old ale house, where sawdust covered the floors and the bartender knew not to remember faces. She'll fold, Doyle told them, downing his second whiskey. Gave her the speech, showed strength, made it clear this isn't negotiable. She's smart enough to know she can't fight us. One of his men, Danny, younger guy, recent addition, asked the question quietly, what if she doesn't fold? Doyle smiled. The same smile he'd used in Stephanie's office. Then Friday afternoon we go back to that fancy Sugar Hill apartment, and we teach her what happens when women try playing gangster. She'll fold though. They always do when it gets real. The crew drank. Celebrated prematurely. None of them noticed the man in the corner booth. Older black man, well-dressed, reading a newspaper. He'd been there when they arrived. Stayed after they left. Bumpy Johnson finished his drink slowly, folded his newspaper, and walked out into the October cold. He had a phone call to make. October 10th. 9:23 a.m. 38 hours and 37 minutes remained on Doyle's deadline. He woke up in his apartment on West 47th Street, made coffee, read the morning paper. Checked in with his crew. Made plans for Friday's collection visit, to Stephanie's office. Everything proceeding normally. He didn't know that in 3 separate locations across Manhattan, 3 different people were having 3 different conversations, all about him, none of them favorable. He didn't know his gambling debts had been quietly purchased by someone new. He didn't know that a journalist at the Amsterdam News was compiling a file about Irish mob violence in Harlem, complete with witness statements and photographs. He didn't know that Stephanie St. Clair had already made the 4 most important phone calls of his rapidly shortening life. Reputation, violence, and natural order. Jimmy Doyle believed in all 3. Stephanie St. Clair believed in information, patience, and inevitability. The next 38 hours would determine whose belief system more accurately reflected reality. 48 hours sounds like a deadline. For Stephanie St. Clair, it was a timeline. A carefully measured span of time in which to move pieces across a board Jimmy Doyle didn't know he was playing on. 48 hours to activate networks built over 22 years. 48 hours to turn a man's assumptions into his own trap. Stephanie didn't need violence. She needed precision. And she had exactly 48 hours to execute 6 movements that would end Jimmy Doyle without her fingerprints ever appearing on the outcome. Hours 1 to 12. Intelligence gathering. October 9, 3:27 p.m. 3 minutes after Doyle left her office. The first phone call went to Samuel Richardson, one of her runners, but more importantly, a man whose cousin worked as a clerk at the 10th Precinct in Hell's Kitchen. Richardson had been on Stephanie's payroll since 1927. Loyalty bought with fair wages, respect, and the knowledge that Stephanie protected her people. "I need everything about Jimmy Doyle," Stephanie said. "Arrest. Known associates. Where he drinks. Where he lives. Where he owes money. 24 hours. Richardson delivered in 18. By October 10, 9 a.m., Stephanie had a file. James Patrick Doyle. Born 1899, Hell's Kitchen. Arrest record: assault, 1919, armed robbery, 1921, charges dropped, suspicion of murder, 1928, insufficient evidence, illegal gambling operation, 1932, 60-day sentence. Known associate of Vincent Call until 1932. Current residence: 412 West 47th Street, Apartment 3B. Regular establishments: McSorley's Old Ale House, Tuesday/Thursday nights, O'Malley's Pub, Friday/Saturday, betting parlor on West 39th, Monday afternoons. Known debts: $8,400 to Italian bookmakers, collections handled through Genovese family intermediaries. 3 months overdue. Payment deadline extended twice. That last detail made Stephanie pause. $8,400. 3 months overdue. Extensions granted. Which meant Doyle was useful to the Italians but not essential. Which meant he was vulnerable. Which meant his Harlem expansion wasn't just territorial ambition, it was financial desperation. Desperate men made mistakes. Stephanie intended to help him make several. The second call went to Marcus Williams, the collector Doyle's men had hospitalized. He'd been released from Harlem Hospital on October 8, back home with his wife and 2 children, nursing broken ribs and wondering if he still had a job. Stephanie visited personally. Rare for her, which made the gesture more powerful. She arrived at Marcus's apartment on 133rd Street with an envelope containing $500, more than 6 months' wages for most Harlem workers, and a promise. "Your job is waiting when you're healed," she said, sitting in his modest living room while his wife brought coffee. "And the men who did this will not be a problem much longer." Marcus stared. "Mississippi St. Clair, I don't want no more trouble." "There won't be trouble," Stephanie interrupted. "I need information. What did they say? What did they look like? Where did they take you before the beating?" Marcus described 3 men. Red-haired leader. Warehouse location near the Hudson, West 38th Street area. They'd bragged about taking over Harlem and teaching the numbers queen her place. Stephanie filed every detail. Before leaving, she placed another $200 on the table. "For your wife. For the children. You work for me, I protect you. That's not negotiable." Marcus's wife cried. Not from fear. From relief. This was why Harlem stood with Stephanie St. Clair. Not because she was the most violent. Because she was the most loyal. Hours 13 to 24. Leverage building. October 10, 11 a.m. The third phone call was the most delicate. Detective William Madden, 32nd Precinct. Irish cop, 23 years on the force, 15 of them in Harlem. He'd taken bribes from various operators over the years, including Stephanie, though she preferred to think of them as information-sharing arrangements. More importantly, Madden owed her. A robbery at a jewelry store on 125th Street. Police had no leads. Stephanie's network had names, locations, and stolen merchandise within 48 hours. She'd given Madden everything anonymously. He'd made the arrest. Got promoted. He hadn't forgotten. Stephanie didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need a favor. Mississippi St. Clair. Madden's voice carried caution. I'm listening. Jimmy Doyle. Hell's Kitchen operator. I need to know his movements Thursday evening, October 11th. Where he'll be, what time, who he'll be with. Silence on the line. Then, why? Because he made a mistake entering my territory. And because you owe me. 1931. The jewelry store. More silence. Madden knew she was right. Knew he owed her. Knew that refusing would complicate his comfortable arrangement. I'll make inquiries, he said finally. But Mississippi St. Clair, if this comes back on me? It won't. It never does. She hung up. By 6 p.m. that evening, Madden called back. Doyle had a standing appointment Thursday nights at McSorley's, but this Thursday he'd scheduled a meeting at a warehouse on West 38th Street. 10:30 p.m. 3 of his crew confirmed. Stephanie wrote down the address. West 38th, near the Hudson. Same area Marcus had described. Doyle was predictable. Creatures of habit always were. The fourth call went to James Hubert. Hubert edited the crime section of the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential black newspaper, read by 70,000 people weekly. He'd covered Stephanie's arrests, her court victories, her battles with Dutch Schultz. He appreciated good stories, especially stories about powerful white criminals exploiting black neighborhoods. Mr. Hubert. Stephanie St. Clair. I have a story for you. She spent 20 minutes laying out Jimmy Doyle's campaign. The intimidation, the vandalism, Marcus's hospitalization. She provided names, dates, locations. She framed it perfectly. Irish mob violence targets Harlem businesses. Community leaders demand police action. Hubert listened, took notes. When do you need this published? Friday morning, October 12th. Front page if possible. That's fast, Mississippi St. Clair. The story is time-sensitive. By Friday, Jimmy Doyle will be significantly less able to dispute the facts. Hubert paused. Caught the implication. Decided not to ask for clarification. I'll have it ready. Stephanie thanked him and hung up. The article would serve two purposes. Document Doyle's violence publicly and provide narrative cover for whatever happened Thursday night. If Doyle disappeared or turned up dead, the newspaper would establish motive for multiple parties, not just Stephanie. Plausible deniability through public record. Hours 25 to 36. The setup. October 10th, 9:30 p.m. Stephanie made the fifth call. The most dangerous one. Lorenzo Lenny Accardi. Italian enforcer connected to the Genovese family. He handled collections, including Jimmy Doyle's $8,400 gambling debt. Stephanie had never dealt with Accardi directly. But she dealt with his boss, Tony Rizzo, a mid-level Genovese operator who controlled bookmaking operations across Lower Manhattan. She'd provided Rizzo with information in 1933 about a Dutch Schultz operation that was encroaching on Italian territory. Rizzo had appreciated the tip. Owed her a favor. She was calling it in. Mr. Accardi. My name is Stephanie St. Clair. Tony Rizzo can confirm my credibility. I have information about Jimmy Doyle that concerns your employers. Accardi's voice was careful. I'm listening. Doyle owes your organization $8,400. He's 3 months overdue. Extensions granted twice. You're wondering if he's good for it. That's internal business, miss. He's not good for it. He's expanding into Harlem to cover the debt. But he's also skimming from his current operations. I have documentation. Bank records showing deposits that don't match his reported earnings. He's been holding out on his partners. That got Accardi's attention. You have proof? She didn't? Not exactly. But she had enough. Marcus's descriptions of the warehouse, financial records she'd obtained through her networks showing Doyle's cash flow didn't match his lifestyle expenses. Enough to plant doubt. I can provide documentation by tomorrow. But more importantly, Doyle's planning something Thursday night. 10:30 p.m. Warehouse on West 38th Street near the Hudson. Meeting with his crew. If your organization wanted to have a conversation about his debt and his honesty, that would be an opportune time. Long silence. Why are you telling me this? Cardi asked. Because Doyle threatened my operations. Because he disrespected my territory. And because I prefer to solve problems through strategic partnerships rather than violence. Your organization gets its money, or get satisfaction for being cheated. I get Doyle out of Harlem. Everyone benefits. Accardi didn't commit. Didn't refuse. Said he'd pass the information along. That was enough. Stephanie hung up and allowed herself a small smile. If the Italians acted, Doyle would disappear and no one would connect it to her. If they didn't act, she had backup plans, plural. Hours 37 to 48, the alibi. October 11th, 2 p.m. Stephanie made 3 final calls. All social. All strategic. First, Charles Wright, Harlem businessman who owned a successful funeral home and served on the local community board. Respected. Connected. Could she join him for dinner and jazz at the Cotton Club Thursday evening, October 11th? Wright was delighted. He'd been trying to court Stephanie's favor for years. Second, Councilman Robert Dixon. Could he and his wife attend the Cotton Club this evening as her guests? She had a table reserved 9 p.m. Dixon accepted immediately. Being seen with Stephanie St. Clair was politically useful in Harlem. Third, Captain Gerald Morrison, 28th Precinct. Not corrupt like Madden but pragmatic. Understood power. Could he join a social gathering Thursday evening, purely social, no business discussed, at the Cotton Club? Morrison hesitated. Then agreed. Keeping relationships with influential Harlem figures was part of the job. By 8:30 p.m. Thursday evening, Stephanie had assembled a table of 12 witnesses at the Cotton Club. Business leaders, a city councilman, a police captain, socialites, a journalist from the New York Age. All respectable. All credible. All able to testify that Stephanie St. Clair was dining, dancing, and socializing from 9 p.m. until after midnight on October 11, 1934. Nowhere near Hell's Kitchen. Nowhere near West 38th Street. Nowhere near whatever happened to Jimmy Doyle. She'd made 8 phone calls across 48 hours. She'd activated 5 different networks. Her runners, her informants, police contacts, newspaper editors, Italian mob intermediaries. She'd constructed a web where every thread led away from her and toward Jimmy Doyle's vulnerabilities. His debts, his violence, his predictability, his arrogance. October 11th, 10 p.m. Stephanie sat at her Cotton Club table, wearing a burgundy evening gown and pearls, laughing at a story Councilman Dixon was telling. A jazz band played Ellington. Champagne flowed. She looked radiant, relaxed, unthreatening. At 10:32 p.m., a waiter delivered a telephone to her table, emergency call. She excused herself gracefully, walked to the lobby, picked up the receiver. A voice said one word, done. Stephanie said, thank you, and hung up. She returned to her table, smiled at Captain Morrison, and ordered another bottle of champagne. Outside, October rain began falling. In Hell's Kitchen, Jimmy Doyle's final mistake was realizing, far too late, that he'd misunderstood everything about Stephanie St. Clair. Not a woman playing gangster. A master strategist who just orchestrated his ending while drinking champagne and dancing to jazz. October 11, 1934. 2 timelines. 1 ending. Timeline A, West 38th Street, Hell's Kitchen. 10:15 p.m. Jimmy Doyle stepped out of a taxi 3 blocks from the warehouse. Rain hammered the pavement, turned the streets into reflecting pools of yellow streetlight. He wore his good coat, wool, expensive, the kind that announced success, and kept his right hand near the revolver in his shoulder holster. Not because he expected trouble. Because a man in his position always stayed ready. 2 of his crew waited at the corner. Danny and Vic, both armed, both loyal enough. They'd been with him since the call days, understood how things worked. Everything set? Doyle asked. Danny nodded. Contact said 10:30. Warehouse is clear. Just a conversation about the Harlem expansion, making sure there's no territorial conflicts with other operations. Doyle had received the meeting request that afternoon. Anonymous intermediary, claimed to represent interested parties, who wanted to discuss his Harlem plans. Make sure everyone's interests aligned. Standard criminal diplomacy. He'd assumed it was the Italians. Maybe checking on his debt repayment timeline. Fine. He'd explained that the Harlem operation would generate enough revenue to settle accounts within 3 months. Show strength. Show initiative. Prove he was more than hired muscle. The warehouse sat near the Hudson River, West 38th between 10th and 11th Avenues. Industrial area. Quiet after dark. Perfect for discreet conversations. They walked the final 2 blocks in silence. Rain soaked through Doyle's coat by the time they reached the warehouse entrance. A rusted steel door, slightly ajar, darkness beyond. Wait here, Doyle told his men. I go in first. Professional courtesy. Danny looked uncertain. Boss, maybe we should. Wait here, Doyle repeated. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warehouse smelled like old machinery and river water. Single overhead light in the back corner, creating more shadows than illumination. Doyle's eyes adjusted slowly. 4 men stood in the light. Not the men he expected. 10:28 p.m. Lorenzo Accardi stepped forward first. Doyle recognized him. Genovese enforcer, handled collections. The 3 men behind him were unfamiliar but clearly Italian, clearly armed, clearly not here for friendly conversation. Doyle's stomach dropped. Mr. Doyle, Accardi said. Voice flat. Professional. The tone of a man conducting business, not making threats. Which somehow made it worse. We need to talk about your debt. Doyle forced confidence into his voice. I'm working on it. The Harlem expansion. I explained the timeline. We're not here about the timeline. Accardi lit a cigarette, took his time. We're here about the skimming. The word hung in the air like a verdict. I don't know what you. Accardi held up a hand. Please don't insult us both. We have records. Bank deposits that don't match reported earnings. You've been holding out on your partners. Paying us late while living well. That's disrespect, Mr. Doyle. Doyle's mind raced. Who provided the records? Who knew his financial details? Who would? And then he understood. Stephanie St. Clair. The realization hit like cold water. The woman he'd threatened. The woman who'd sat calmly behind her desk and said she'd consider his offer. She hadn't been considering surrender. She'd been making phone calls. This is a setup, Doyle said. That Harlem woman, she fed you false information. She's trying to. Stephanie St. Clair provided initial intelligence, Accardi acknowledged. We verified independently. The information is accurate, Mr. Doyle. You've been dishonest. And dishonesty in our business has consequences. 10:34 p.m. Doyle reached for his revolver. He was fast. Trained. Had drawn on men before. Not fast enough. The first shot came from his right, one of Accardi's men, positioned in shadows. The bullet caught Doyle in the shoulder, spun him sideways. His revolver clattered to the concrete floor. He tried to run. Made it 3 steps before the second shot hit his leg. He fell. Accardi walked over slowly. Looked down. No anger in his expression. No satisfaction. Just a man completing a job. Your debt was $8,400, Accardi said. Your disrespect was worse. Mississippi St. Clair sends her regards. The third shot was final. 10:47 p.m. 2 of Accardi's men wrapped Doyle's body in canvas tarp. Loaded it into a truck. Drove 6 blocks to the Hudson River Pier. The body entered the water at 10:52 p.m., weighted with chains, disappearing into black current. Outside the warehouse, Danny and Vic heard the shots. Heard the truck. Made the smart decision, they ran. By 11 p.m. the warehouse was empty. Rain washed blood into floor drains. By morning there would be no evidence anyone had been there at all. Timeline B, the Cotton Club, Harlem. 9 p.m. Stephanie St. Clair arrived at the Cotton Club precisely on time. The doorman, who'd known her for 8 years, greeted her by name, took her coat, escorted her to the reserved table. Best table in the house. Center floor. Perfect view of the band. Perfect visibility for everyone to see exactly who was there. Councilman Robert Dixon and his wife arrived at 9:15. Captain Gerald Morrison at 9:30. Charles Wright and 3 other Harlem business leaders by 9:45. By 10 p.m., Stephanie's table seated 12 people. Champagne flowing. Dinner ordered. Duke Ellington's orchestra playing Sophisticated Lady. Stephanie wore burgundy silk and pearls. Hair perfectly styled. Makeup immaculate. She looked like money and power and absolute control. She laughed at jokes. Made small talk. Asked Captain Morrison about his daughter's wedding plans. Discussed business opportunities with Charles Wright. Complimented Councilman Dixon's recent speech about Harlem investment. She was charming. Elegant. The center of attention at a table full of Harlem's most respectable citizens. At 10:15 p.m., exactly when Jimmy Doyle stepped out of his taxi in Hell's Kitchen, Stephanie was ordering her second glass of champagne. At 10:28 p.m., exactly when Doyle realized he'd been set up, Stephanie was dancing. Her partner, a prominent Harlem doctor who'd been trying to court her attention for months. She allowed him to dance. Smiled appropriately. Maintained perfect composure. At 10:32 p.m., a waiter approached. Telephone call in the lobby. Urgent. Stephanie excused herself gracefully. Walked to the lobby, still visible to half the club, still clearly inside the Cotton Club, nowhere near Hell's Kitchen. She picked up the receiver. "Done," said the voice on the other end. One of her runners, watching from a safe distance. Confirmation that the timeline had reached its conclusion. "Thank you," Stephanie said. "Come." Measured. She hung up. Returned to her table. At 10:34 p.m., exactly when the first shot hit Jimmy Doyle, Stephanie was raising her champagne glass in a toast. "To Harlem," she said. "And to all of us who protect it." 12 people raised their glasses. 12 witnesses to her exact location. 12 respectable, credible voices who could testify under oath that Stephanie St. Clair was at the Cotton Club all evening, surrounded by community leaders and a police captain. Nowhere near violence. Nowhere near Hell's Kitchen. Nowhere near whatever happened to Jimmy Doyle. At 10:52 p.m., exactly when Doyle's body entered the Hudson, Stephanie was laughing at a story Councilman Dixon's wife was telling about their anniversary trip to Atlantic City. She looked radiant. Unburdened. A woman enjoying an evening with friends. 11:30 p.m. The evening wound down. Stephanie thanked her guests, paid the substantial bill without blinking, left generous tips for the waitstaff. Captain Morrison walked her to her car, a Cadillac driven by one of her runners. "Wonderful evening, Mississippi St. Clair," Morrison said. "We should do this more often." "Absolutely, Captain. I believe strongly in community relationships." She shook his hand. Let him open her car door. Smiled as he closed it. The Cadillac pulled away from the Cotton Club at 11:47 p.m. Inside, alone finally, Stephanie allowed herself one deep breath. Then she opened her handbag and removed a small notebook. Crossed off a single name, James Patrick Doyle. Below it, 3 other names remained. Other threats. Other problems. Other men who'd underestimated her and would eventually learn the same lesson Doyle had learned too late. The car moved through Harlem's rain-soaked streets. Past brownstones and churches. Past betting parlors and jazz clubs. Past the empire she'd built with intelligence, patience, and strategic precision. An empire men kept trying to take. An empire she kept protecting without firing a single shot herself. The rain continued. The city slept. And somewhere in the Hudson River, Jimmy Doyle's body drifted toward the Atlantic, carried by currents that didn't care about reputation, violence, or the natural order of power. They only cared about inevitability. And Stephanie St. Clair had always understood inevitability better than anyone. October 12, 1934. 8:37 a.m. A dock worker found Jimmy Doyle's body snagged on a pier piling near West 26th Street. Bloated. Wrapped in canvas. Weighted with chains that hadn't been heavy enough. The Hudson River gave up its secrets slowly, reluctantly, but it always gave them up eventually. NYPD detectives from the 10th Precinct arrived by 9:15 a.m. They photographed the scene, documented 3 gunshot wounds, noted the professional execution style. By 10 a.m., they'd identified the body through fingerprints on file from Doyle's 1932 gambling conviction. By 10:30 a.m., they'd begun investigating. The investigation lasted 4 days and produced nothing. No witnesses. No murder weapon. No physical evidence beyond the body itself. Doyle's known associates, Danny and Vic, had disappeared immediately after Thursday night, too terrified to talk even if detectives found them. The Italians who'd actually pulled the triggers? They had alibis. Dinner with family. Card games with witnesses. The machinery of organized crime protecting its own. And Stephanie St. Clair? The detectives interviewed her on October 14th at her Edgecombe Avenue office. She sat behind her mahogany desk, composed and cooperative. Yes, she'd heard of Mr. Doyle. No, she'd never met him. Thursday evening, October 11th? She provided a list of 12 witnesses who could confirm her presence at the Cotton Club from 9 p.m. until nearly midnight, including Captain Gerald Morrison of the 28th Precinct. The detective conducting the interview closed his notebook. He knew exactly what had happened. Knew Stephanie had orchestrated it. Couldn't prove a single connection. "Thank you for your time, Mississippi St. Clair," he said. "Always happy to assist the police," she replied. The investigation quietly closed 3 weeks later. Cause of death, homicide. Suspects unknown. Case status, open but inactive. Jimmy Doyle became a statistic. Another body in the river. Another casualty of New York's underworld. His name appeared in newspapers for exactly 2 days, then vanished from public memory. But his ending echoed through Harlem and Hell's Kitchen for years. The immediate consequences were precise. Doyle's remaining crew abandoned all plans for Harlem expansion. Danny and Vic resurfaced in Boston 6 months later, working for significantly less ambitious operations, never speaking about October 11, 1934. The Irish operators who'd considered following Doyle into Harlem reconsidered. The math changed. The risk-reward calculation shifted. Stephanie St. Clair wasn't a target. She was someone requiring diplomacy, negotiation, respect. The Italian families took note. A black woman had provided intelligence, manipulated circumstances, and eliminated a problem without direct involvement. That required sophistication, strategic thinking, the kind of intelligence they recognized and valued. Future interactions with Stephanie became more careful, more respectful. She wasn't the woman running numbers. She was Madame St. Clair, an operator, power broker. In Harlem, Stephanie's legend solidified. Marcus Williams, the collector who'd been hospitalized, returned to work in November. He told everyone who'd listen about Stephanie's visit, the money, the promise. She said he wouldn't be a problem. 2 days later he wasn't. That's Queenie. The story spread through Harlem's networks like gospel. The numbers queen who protected her people. Who didn't just talk about loyalty but demonstrated it. Who defeated powerful white gangsters not with guns but with phone calls and strategic brilliance. Other operators, the men who'd secretly hoped Doyle would succeed, who'd resented taking orders from a woman, re-evaluated their positions. Challenging Stephanie St. Clair wasn't just difficult. It was potentially fatal. She'd proven something that October. Intelligence was more dangerous than violence. Information was more powerful than weapons. And underestimating her based on gender or race wasn't just foolish, it was suicidal. The Amsterdam News ran the story James Hubert had prepared. Irish mob violence targets Harlem, perpetrator found dead before justice could be served. The article detailed Doyle's campaign of intimidation, included interviews with victims, documented police inaction. It framed his death as street justice, consequences for terrorizing black neighborhoods. It never mentioned Stephanie St. Clair. It didn't need to. Everyone in Harlem knew exactly who'd orchestrated Jimmy Doyle's ending. The article simply provided the official narrative, the public story that allowed everyone to move forward without uncomfortable questions. Stephanie clipped the article, filed it with dozens of others documenting her battles, her victories, her strategic campaigns against those who threatened her empire. October 1934 was one victory among many. Stephanie St. Clair continued operating through the 1930s and into the 1940s. She fought Dutch Schultz, the most notorious battle where she used newspapers, legal challenges and public exposure to make his Harlem operations too costly to maintain. When Schultz was murdered in 1935, she allegedly sent a telegram to his hospital bed, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." She fought corrupt police through systematic documentation and public shaming, taking out newspaper ads listing officers who accepted bribes, publishing evidence that forced resignations and transfers. She fought the Italian mafia to standstills, negotiating territorial agreements from positions of strength because they'd learned, as Doyle had learned, that destroying her was more expensive than coexisting with her. She mentored Bumpy Johnson, who eventually became Harlem's most famous gangster. But he started as her employee, her student, learning the art of strategic power from a master. She married Sufi Abdul Hamid in the late 1930s, a complicated, ultimately tragic relationship that ended in violence and her temporary imprisonment. Even then, she navigated the legal system with characteristic intelligence, serving minimal time, emerging with her operations intact. She semi-retired in the 1960s as Harlem changed, as the numbers racket became increasingly controlled by larger criminal organizations, as the world she'd built transformed into something different. She died in 1969, 83 years old. In her own bed, not in the river, not in prison, not broken by the forces that had tried for decades to destroy her. History tried to erase Stephanie St. Clair. Tried to reduce her to footnote. To female gangster curiosity. To the woman who worked for Bumpy Johnson instead of the woman who employed him. Tried to erase the immigrant girl from Martinique who built an empire through brilliance, who protected Harlem when no one else would, who proved that power didn't require violence. Only intelligence, patience and absolute refusal to accept the limitations others imposed. But her legacy survived in the stories. In the memories of families she helped during the Depression. In the tradition of strategic thinking she established. In the proof that a black Caribbean woman could outmaneuver white male gangsters, corrupt police, and systemic oppression simultaneously. Jimmy Doyle thought a woman couldn't fight back. His body was found in 48 hours. And Stephanie St. Clair never touched him. That's the difference between force and power. That's the lesson history keeps trying to erase. That's why her story matters.